just going to let you know right up front, this is not a normal Mother's Day message. There are no flowers as a part of my PowerPoint today. And I'm not going to be talking about why moms are better than dads or why you should love your mom or anything like that. All that stuff's probably true. That's just not what I'm going to talk about in the message today. Because we are nearing the end of our study in the book of Nehemiah. And this has been a 10-part look at leadership lessons from the story of Nehemiah in the Bible. I hope that you've been challenged by this series as we look at these leadership lessons. And even though this isn't a specifically mothers-oriented message, the truth is that our moms are all leaders, aren't they? And so this absolutely is for mothers. It's just not just for mothers. And moms are all raising up leaders. And so there are good principles from the book of Nehemiah that you as moms can teach your kids or those who you are mentoring spiritually, your spiritual children. So it's not just a Mother's Day message, but it's a message for moms and it's for everyone. I think my favorite thing about this series has been how we've had 5 different leaders from our church take part in teaching the messages. We had 2 executive pastors preach, and we had all 3 senior pastors of this church from the past and current all preaching together as a part of this series. And that was just awesome. Each one brought different strengths and different insights out of the text that I wouldn't have thought of if they hadn't come and brought their unique perspective to it. So this week I went back and looked at all of the previous messages in this series. And I wrote down what I felt like was the key takeaway from every single one of them. And I want to share those with you now because I think it's good for us to go back and review kind of where have we come from as we're about to wrap up this series. We've got today's message and next week's message, and then we're done with the book of Nehemiah, at least for a while. So let me share this with you. Here are the key takeaways that I got from each of these messages. Number 1, leaders should allow themselves to be deeply moved by problems that affect other people. From the second week, leaders shouldn't just ask God to fix a problem. They should ask God to help them be part of the solution. Week 3, leaders should get everyone involved wherever they are at right now. Week 4, leaders must deal with discouragement by focusing on the right things and not giving up. Leaders are at their best when their purpose is to glorify God. Leaders should respond to antagonists with discernment, focusing on the mission and leaving vengeance to God. That was with Mike Andrus, our first senior pastor. And then our next senior pastor, Bill Jones, taught us that leaders need to be transformed before they can multiply transformed people. It's got to start with you and me before we can transform others. And then last week, leaders need to guide people into a cycle of cleansing by God, not a cycle of collapse through human effort. So what do you think? Do you see anything in that list that resonates with you, that you find especially helpful, that you're able to apply in your life? Here's what I want to do. I want to put those 8 principles on the screen behind me and give you a chance to share with someone sitting next to you or in front of you or behind you, or if you want to yell at somebody across the room, that's fine too. Just talk with each other about which one of these is the most helpful or meaningful for you and why, okay? I know this is a little different, but just take a minute, talk amongst yourself for the next couple of minutes. I'll give you a timer so that you know when we're done. good thoughts that we had here. Hopefully you had some good thoughts as well. There was a really interesting point that was just brought up to me that I think I'm just going to go ahead and speak to because I ran out of time sitting on the front row, which is this is all about leaders. We've got leaders all over this thing. What about those of us who aren't leaders? And I think it's true that there are some people that have certain special giftings in leadership, no question. But it's also true that every one of us are leaders in different ways. Every one of us has a group of people that we in some way influence, whether it's our family or our friends. Every one of you who is involved in some way in serving here in some capacity are leading people. We have some awesome new ushers that are really young, and they are leaders. They are helping to lead people. They're leading people into the auditorium, first and foremost. They're leading people by giving them a program every week, but they're also leading by their example, right? By showing that anyone can get involved and serve. And so all of us, in one sense or another, I believe, are leaders. And all of us can take these things and apply them in our particular context, although it's going to look different for different people. Now, there's two things I want to share with you today. One thing I want to do is just to teach the next segment of Nehemiah. Okay, so in this narrative that we're walking through, I just want to show you, okay, what's happening with our good buddy Nehemiah right now? What's going on? What is he doing? But the second thing I want to do is to give you a takeaway from our passage today, something that you can walk away with and hopefully begin to start chewing on and thinking about and applying in your life today. It's also something that will give you a little glimpse into some of the vision that we have for the future of this church. I'm going to talk about something that I hope becomes a part of our DNA here, something that as many of us as possible will get involved in, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So let's check in with Nehemiah and see what he's doing. Our passage today is 2 chapters long. That's Nehemiah 11 and 12. And if 2 chapters seems like an awful lot to cover in one service, you're not alone. I feel that way too. I don't know who assigned these chapters, my goodness, but how did I end up with 2 chapters to cover here? Just to give you an idea of what this is like, these 2 chapters have 83 verses in them. 83. Now, 71 of those 83 verses are just lists of names and places. Names and places, mostly names. Sometimes some places where there are some names of people who settled there. Names and places. About 200 different names are mentioned in these 2 chapters. 200! And over 3,000 people are referenced indirectly through family groups in this passage that we're going to talk about today. Now, I am not going to read to you all 83 verses because that would probably take about half of our message time. And you know what? If you want to go back later today, maybe over Mother's Day lunch, and read through all of these lists of names, it's a fantastic exercise in pronouncing difficult names. So please, by all means, but I do want you to get a sense for what is in these chapters. I want you to kind of understand it. So we're going to walk through a little bit today. And I also want you to understand why those names are there, because it seems a little strange, but we're going to talk about that later. So if you want to follow along, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 11. That's where we'll start. We'll also be in chapter 12. You can also follow in the YouVersion Bible app. Go to events in First Free Church or at efree.org/Bible. There are 6 different sections in this passage we're going to cover today, these 2 chapters, 6 different sections. The first one helps us to understand a little bit some of the other ones that are in there. And you need a little bit of background before we dive into this. So the city of Jerusalem before Nehemiah, and especially before Zerubbabel, but around the time both of these guys were there, was pretty much a wasteland. It was not a great city to be in. The walls had been torn down before. Of course, as we're following Nehemiah in this story, the walls are built now. But the walls were torn down previously. The buildings were torn down. There was piles of rubble all over the place. The houses were in disrepair. It was mostly vacant. Not a lot of people lived there. A few leaders had come back to live there by this point, but not a lot of other people. So it just was not a very happening city. This was a place that would have been a difficult place to move into and live in. There just wasn't much going on, so not many people were there. And here's the sad part about it. Jerusalem is referred to as the holy city. Why? Because this is the place where they built a temple And God intended to meet with people here and for people to gather together and worship him here. Jerusalem was this special place that was significant to God and to the people. And it was now in disrepair and somewhat abandoned, a little bit of a ghost town. That's the setting for Jerusalem, and that's what makes this first section so important. So we're going to look at 6 different sections of these passages here, just to get the big picture perspective, and then we're going to dive into one a little bit. Our first section describes the people relocating to the city of Jerusalem. Here's what that looks like in Nehemiah chapter 11, verse 1. The leaders of the people were living in Jerusalem, just the leaders, the holy city. 1/10 of the people from the other towns of Judah and Benjamin, that's areas around Jerusalem, were chosen by sacred lots to live there too, while the rest stayed where they were. And the people commended everyone who volunteered to resettle in Jerusalem. Now, we're going to come back to this later, this first section about relocating to Jerusalem. We'll come back there. But let's keep moving so we can get the big picture here. Section 2 is a list of the provincial officials, the government officials that came back to move into Jerusalem. And here's what that looks like. Here's a list of the names of the provincial officials who came to live in Jerusalem. Most of the people, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants, continued to live in their own homes in the various towns of Judah. But some of the people from Judah and Benjamin resettled in Jerusalem. Okay, so here's the list. You ready for this? I hope you can read fast. Here you go. Did you get all that? That's the list. One of the lists. Section 3 is another list. A list of where people lived who didn't come to Jerusalem. So we've got that too. Would you like to see it? Lots of very interesting names in here. Section 4 is a list of the priests and Levites who served in the days of Nehemiah. Not all of these lived in Jerusalem, but this is a list of all the priests and the Levites. 26 verses. Again, some amazing names in here. Keep your eyes out, because I know there are a lot of us here who are expecting, and you're always looking for a creative and unusual name. Your prayers have been answered. You catching all these? Meshulamim, Miniamim, all kinds of good stuff in there. Talmon is a great one. Acub. I don't hear too many kids named Acub these days. Anyway, section 5 is the dedication of the newly restored wall of Jerusalem. So they built up the wall, we've talked about that, and now they're going to dedicate this wall to God. They're going to thank God for it and praise God for it. This is not a list of names. There's a little bit of that, but we're going to walk through it here together. He says, for the dedication of the new wall of Jerusalem, the Levites throughout the land were asked to come to Jerusalem to assist in the ceremonies. They were to take part in the joyous occasion with their songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The singers were brought together from the region around Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites. They also came from Beth Gilgal and the rural areas near Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built their own settlements around Jerusalem. The priests and Levites first purified themselves, then they purified the people, the gates, and the wall. I, Nehemiah, led the leaders of Judah to the top of the wall and organized 2 large choirs to give thanks. One of the choirs proceeded southward along the top of the wall to the dung gate. So let me give you a mental picture of what this looks like. The city of Jerusalem today is massive. But then there's the old city of Jerusalem, which is much smaller. And then there's the city of Jerusalem from the days of Nehemiah, which is literally a sliver compared to even the old city of Jerusalem. Back then, it wasn't very big. What you had was the city of David, which was old Jerusalem, this little area down here. And then you had a palace for the king, and you had some other buildings and things, and then you had the temple above that. So the temple was at the top, and then you had some other stuff at the far north, and then you had the palace and some other royal buildings and things, and then you get further down to the house that David lived in a long time ago, and then you get into a bunch of other houses where the people lived and all that stuff. Just this little sliver of Jerusalem. And what Nehemiah did is he gathered the people and had them move to the top of the westernmost wall. So this wall that goes all the way around this that they just built, he had them gather on the top of the westernmost wall. And one of the choirs, half of the group, went south down that wall. So from your perspective, I think they're over here, and half the group went north, half the group went south, and then they went over here to the Dung Gate, which doesn't sound very beautiful, but it is actually a cool place. Hoshea and half the leaders of Judah followed them, along with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah. Then came some priests who played trumpets, including Zechariah, son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Micaiah, son of Zechur, a descendant of Asaph. Now, why is Asaph important? Anyone remember? Asaph was a great songwriter who wrote many of the Psalms that we have. Along with David, Asaph was one of the key guys that initiated the song ministry in Israel. And Zechariah's colleagues were Shemaiah, Azarel, Milalai, Gilalai, Maai, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani. They used the musical instruments prescribed by David, the man of God. Ezra the scribe led this procession. At the fountain gate, they went straight up the steps on the ascent of the city wall toward the city of David. So this is the group that started on the west side, went down south, went around the Dung Gate, and then they got to the fountain gate, and then they went up the steps in the city of David to pass by the house of David. They passed the house of David and then proceeded to the water gate, which is a little more than halfway up than the other side, just south of the temple on the east. The second choir giving thanks went northward. So starting from the same spot, they went north, the other direction, around the other way to meet them. I, Nehemiah, followed them together with the other half of the people, along the top of the wall, past the Tower of the Ovens, to the broad wall, which the broad wall is this really big, thick wall that encompassed a larger area of Jerusalem before Nehemiah's time, and the remnants of that wall are still there today. So the broad wall, you can actually go see a section of the broad wall that's been excavated, and it's a huge, huge wall that's there. Then past the Ephraim gate to the old city gate, past the fish gate, and the Tower of Hananel, and on the Tower of the 100. Then we continued on to the sheep gate. That's a gate where they used to bring the sheep through to be sacrificed at the temple, and they'd be washed at the pools of Bethesda and then brought into the temple, and stopped at the guard gate. The two choirs that were giving thanks at this point have made their way all the way around from the western side to the eastern side. Did I get that right? Yes, that's right for you. The western side to the eastern side, they've come together. They're on either side of the temple. One's on the north of the temple, one's on the south of the temple. They were giving thanks, then proceeded to the temple of God where they took their places. So did I, together with a group of leaders who were with me. We went together with the trumpet-playing priests, Eliakim, Maaseiah, Miniamin, Micaiah, Elionai, Zechariah, and Hananiah. See, I'm still getting plenty of names in here, even though we've skipped quite a few. And the singers, Maaseiah, Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzi? I don't know how to say that. Jehohanan, Malchijah, Elam, Edzer. They played and sang loudly under the direction of Jezreiah, the choir director. Many sacrifices were offered on that joyous day, for God had given the people cause for great joy. The women and children also participated in the celebration, and the joy of the people of Jerusalem could be heard far away. Isn't that cool? That's how happy they were. As they blew their trumpets and praised God, people from a long ways away. And remember, Nehemiah had some enemies. Those people from a long ways away could hear their celebration. That's a really neat thought. That's how much they were thankful for what God had done. Then section 6 is provisions that are made for ongoing worship at this temple. So now they have a restored temple. Now they have a restored wall to protect everything. They're planning to move people into this city to be able to rebuild it up. And they want to make sure that the temple worship continues as it's supposed to. And so here's what they do. On that day, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the offerings, the first part of the harvest and the tithes. They were responsible to collect from the fields outside the towns the portions required by the law for the priests and Levites. So basically, like a tax to make sure that the temple worship could continue as God had expected. For all the people of Judah took joy in the priests and Levites in their work. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification as commanded by David and his son Solomon. And so did the singers and the gatekeepers. The custom of having choir directors to lead the choirs in hymns of praise and thanksgiving to God began long ago in the days of David and Asaph. So now, in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel brought a daily supply of food for the singers, the gatekeepers, and the Levites. The Levites in turn gave a portion of what they received to the priests, the descendants of Aaron. And congratulations, we just made it through 2 long chapters of Nehemiah. And yes, I should be applauding you for sitting through all that. There's a lot there, and we actually passed through some of the lists of names as we were working through the chapters there. There's a lot there. Now I want to give you a chance to see what this looks like in one big timeline, okay? So we're going to put this up on the screen. These are the different sections that we just walked through, and if you're taking notes and you want to record these types of things, or you're using the study journal or anything like that, feel free to put those up there. There are a lot of things we could talk about here. There's some interesting stuff. There's the dedication of the wall with the 2 choirs that make their way around Jerusalem. And initially, that's where I wanted to focus today. I thought a week ago that what I was going to do was going to be to map out in this auditorium a model of Jerusalem. And I was going to have some of you come volunteer to go march around the walls of Jerusalem. And so some of you were going to go to the Broad Wall and the Tower of the Ovens, and some of you were going to have to go to the Dung Gate, and kind of a weird place, but whatever. And that's what I was going to do. And then I realized, what are the rest of us going to do when they're marching around the auditorium? That could get a little bit awkward. And I thought more, and I went back to the text, and I thought, what else is in there? There's some interesting stuff at the end, provisions made for ongoing worship at the temple. And a lot of messages about this section of Nehemiah focus on those provisions for temple worship. And they do something which I'm not sure I completely agree with, which is they will walk through those verses that we just talked about, of how they provided for the temple and did the 2 choirs and all the things that they did, and to make sure that there was ongoing worship, and they'll actually try to pull out of that principles for how churches should function today. Well, that's the temple, that's maybe a little bit different. I'm not sure if we can draw a direct application from that for our church today. There's some principles there, and then I kept thinking about the names. Like, why are there so many names in these chapters? Why would this even be recorded for us? 71 out of 83 verses are just a bunch of names and places. And even the places are places where names were settling. That's why they're in there. So why all the names? 200 people or so are mentioned by name in these 2 chapters. People that we know virtually nothing about. And yet it's part of Scripture. God has included this there for us. Why would he do that? And if you've picked up anything about me, it's the question that pops into my head that's the hardest to answer, that I want to spend the most time on. I want to go find out, like, what on earth is the deal with this thing, the name aspect of this? Because doesn't that seem like a really big waste of valuable Scripture real estate? I mean, honestly. It makes me think of what John said at the end of his gospel. He said, Jesus also did many other things. If they were all written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books that would be written. I don't know about you, but I would gladly trade those 71 verses of names for a little bit more of Jesus. I would love to have, and that's like 7 miracles, maybe more. I would love to have more stories about Jesus and less names. And yet God has chosen to preserve for us these lists of names. Have you ever called customer support because you had a simple problem, and then you had to listen to 5 or 10 or 20 minutes of pre-recorded answers to questions that you don't have? You know what I'm talking about? You just call in and you hear that message that says, thank you for calling such and such a company. Our hours are Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4 p.m. And then you're like, I know, that's why I'm calling at this time, because I was hoping to talk to a person who was working there. And then it says something like, the answers to most of your questions are found on our website, so you should probably be there instead of calling us. And then at some point it's like, you probably should have Googled this because you would have found the answer faster. And then they're like, oh, you're still there? Well, you're caller number 42. Or I've actually had some of them just say, after you get through the whole thing, say, I'm sorry, our lines are busy. We can't talk to you right now. And they hang up. They don't even put you on hold. They just hang up. And you have to call again later. Like now it's on me to find out when you're available by just continuing to call and call and call. Well, that's a little bit of how I feel like when I go through some of these lists in the Old Testament. As I'm reading the Bible, I get to some of these lists of names and places, and I'm just like, come on, get me to Jesus. Get me to more Paul. Why do we have to have all of this in there? I'm going to give you 2 reasons. There are 2 reasons why I think these are helpful to us. And the first one is that it speaks to the credibility of the Bible. It helps us to understand that these are historical records, not just mythologies. There's no ancient work of fiction that has the level of detail and the lists of names like this, like we find in Scripture. This is more similar to ancient historical genealogies, which is exactly what it is, than it is to ancient fiction. This is not just some sort of mythological story. These people really existed, and the incredible detail helps us to understand that. In fact, archaeologists are continuously uncovering more evidence that people mentioned in the Bible really existed, even some of the more obscure ones. I'll just give you a few examples from the last 10 years. Within the last 10 years, archaeologists uncovered in the right location, right where it should be, from the time period that it should be, a bulla or a royal seal from King Hezekiah. I've talked about this before. This was in the last 10 years. We had no other information outside of the Bible that told us Hezekiah, the king, existed until this seal, which says Hezekiah and has royal information on it, right where it should be to prove that there was a King Hezekiah. And then, not long after that, they found another bulla, another royal seal of Isaiah. And the way the writing is on here, what really makes the most sense is for this to be the prophet Isaiah. This probably was a royal seal of the prophet Isaiah. But here's one of the most interesting ones. 2 months ago, just 2 months ago, in Israel, where a bunch of us were just a month ago, archaeologists discovered this. This is a seal of a man named Nathan Melech. Has anyone ever heard of Nathan Melech? No, probably not a lot of you have. He's virtually unknown in all of history, outside of the Bible, certainly not at all. And in the Bible, he's mentioned in one place. And he's not mentioned because he's a character of great importance. You'll see why he's mentioned in just a minute. Nathan Melech was an official of King Josiah, and King Josiah was going around ridding the country of idol worship. And here's what we find in 2 Kings. He, that's King Josiah, removed from the entrance of the Lord's temple the horse statues that the former kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were near the quarters of Nathan Melech. That's it. That's all we know about this guy. I mean, we know that he was a eunuch, he was an officer of the court, so he worked for the king, and the king also burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. This is the only place where this guy Nathan Melech is ever mentioned, and we don't know much about him other than he has an incredibly unusual name. He evidently was a eunuch, and he was an officer of the court, so he was involved with King Josiah in some way. And that royal seal that was found, what it says on it is literally belonging to Nathan Melech, servant of the king. That was found 2 months ago. And so archaeologists continue to find things that verify even some of the most obscure people that you would think, why does Nathan Melech even need to be mentioned here? Why is that important that they were burned near his house? But it continues to verify the historical accuracy of the Bible. But even with that, which I think is really cool, even with that, I don't think that's the main reason why these names are included here. How many of you know something about your ancestry? Go ahead and raise your hand. How many of you know something about your ancestry? You can trace back your ancestors a little bit. You know your family heritage. Maybe how many of you know kind of like what country they originally were from? You've traced back that. How many of you would consider genealogy to be like one of your hobbies? Anybody kind of research your family? That's an interesting thing that you do. Does anyone know anything about an ancestor that's really cool? Like some neat thing that they did, or someone that somehow related to you, or like my ancestors knew Abraham Lincoln or something like that? What do you got? So Mark says one of his ancestors was a general under General Washington in the Revolutionary War. That's pretty amazing. Wow. Did you get some of that DNA in you? Military prowess? What else? Yeah. One of your ancestors was William Wallace's brother. That's pretty cool. Awesome. What else? We got another one. Your ancestor was Davy Crockett? Like, not Davy Crockett's brother, the actual Davy Crockett. That's pretty cool. In the earlier service, we actually had someone raise their hand and tell us that they were related to someone who gave the prayer at the first Thanksgiving. And then someone in the balcony raised their hand and said, we're related to him too. So I think they're having a family reunion right now at, Chipotle or something. What else? I saw another hand back here. Yeah. Of Daniel Boone. And Shanna, is that you or Eric or you? Okay, all right, that makes sense, yeah. You're the tough one in the relationship, I know. Anybody else? Anybody have something cool in their history? Yeah. Sorry? Meriwether Lewis is an ancestor of yours. Awesome. Is that, oh yeah, one more.
I have an ancestor who was caught as he was migrating from the east to the west, and he said, the Indians are on the warpath. He was a Quaker, and he said, I disassembled my weapon lest I be tempted to shoot one.
Oh, wow. So one of your ancestors was captured by...
He wasn't captured.
Oh, he wasn't captured.
It was a winter, and he had to overwinter, and he didn't want to engage in violence.
He was a Quaker, and so rather than fight, he disassembled his weapon so that he wouldn't fight anyone. Wow, that's amazing. Now, here's a question for you, for those of you that know something about your history, and I know there's a bunch of you that didn't want to raise your hand and tell about some weird stuff that happened in the past. Afterwards, some of you, after the early service, some people came up and shared some of the interesting things that their families had done that they didn't feel comfortable talking about, and I get that. I get that. Somebody told me, you've heard of the Hatfields and McCoys? I was like, yeah, I've heard of the Hatfields and McCoys. All right. Well, my ancestors had a bigger fight than that with another family, and it was brutal. Okay, all right, that's cool. Didn't want to talk about it in front of everybody else. I don't know why. Anyway, those of you that have something like that, are you proud of that connection? Is that kind of neat for you? I mean, I could even tell some of you when you said it, you're like, we're related to this person. That's really awesome. That's neat. We're proud of that kind of heritage when we have something like that we can look back on. And an ancestor that did something amazing or remarkable or honorable or whatever it may be, that's something that's valuable to us to know. It hopefully inspires you as you think back to those people. Maybe some of you even follow in the footsteps of one of your ancestors. Maybe you are carrying on the job or the ministry or just some weird habits that you inherited from your dad or your mom or your grandparents or whatever it is. We value those kinds of relationships and our heritage that we have when we have it. Time magazine says that the family history research industry is a $1 billion a year industry. There's a lot of money in this. And also, according to them, genealogy study is the second most popular hobby in America. Anybody want to guess what the first most popular hobby is? I heard sleep. That was from a college student. I'm hearing a lot of different things. According to Time, it is gardening. Gardening is the most popular hobby in the United States. All right, let me get back on track here. Genealogies were incredibly important. Understanding where your family came from, the history, that was so important to people in the ancient Near East. They wanted to know where their family came from, so they would write down these things, these records. They couldn't just go look it up on Ancestry.com or something. And so they would have these books that were written to record who was related to whom and what ancestor did something honorable that they might want to remember and hopefully and be inspired by and follow after them in their footsteps. These lists were important to people. I want you just for a minute to imagine that you are like the great-grandson or the great-granddaughter of one of these people that were just mentioned, these people that sacrificed so much to move into the city of Jerusalem. Just imagine that you are their descendant and you can go back and check these records and look at this and see, wow, look at what my great-grandfather did and his family and his wife and all of them, what they sacrificed to move back into Jerusalem. And so they would know how they came to live where they are now. Instead of the land they were originally in, the land they were originally given, wherever that was, they would know, oh, that's why we live in this city, because we came here to reclaim this place for God, to redeem it for God. So now let's go back to Nehemiah chapter 11, verse 1. All the way back to the beginning, the first section that we looked at. It says, the leaders of the people were living in Jerusalem, the holy city. 1/10 of the people from the other towns of Judah and Benjamin were chosen by sacred lots to live there too, while the rest stayed where they were. This is a very short statement, but it would have had a profound impact on these families who had to move. This was not an ideal time to move to Jerusalem. You couldn't really grow much food there because the land wasn't set up for that. There were streets and buildings and homes and walls and all of that. There wasn't much industry going on because there weren't a lot of people who lived there. The former luster of this city was mostly gone at this point. And on top of that, there was still a ton of work to do to fix everything up, to repair some of the buildings and the homes inside and make sure that this could be restored to a proper functioning city. So who would uproot their family and move them into this kind of a situation? Moving to Jerusalem meant leaving your family and your friends. You could still see them, but not as often as you moved into Jerusalem. It often meant building a completely new support network from the people that you knew before. And it meant either finding a new job or relocating your small business without any of your customer base going with you. This was not an easy thing for them to do. It was a huge sacrifice. It was a huge commitment. And get this, some of the people actually volunteered to do it. Verse 2 says, the people commended everyone who volunteered to resettle in Jerusalem. Now this could mean a couple of things. We don't know. It could mean, from verse 1, that the leaders cast lots, which is kind of like rolling dice, basically. It's their version of that, to somehow identify a family and then ask them, are you willing to resettle into Jerusalem? And if they said, yes, we are, they volunteered. And if they said no, we cast lots again and we asked that family. It was just their method of choosing which family to ask first. Could mean that. Or it could mean that the leaders cast lots to identify a family like before, but instead of going to them and saying, would you like to move into Jerusalem? They said, we will now move you into Jerusalem because we're the leaders and we're telling you what to do. And if that's the case, then verse 2 means that other people volunteered to move into Jerusalem as well. We don't know which one is which. Either one is a possibility. And that's not really what matters. What matters is that some people voluntarily gave up all of those connections and jobs and everything they had established and the home that they had been living in and fixing up and all of that. They gave up, they sacrificed that to move into Jerusalem. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? Well, because they believed in a vision that was bigger than their lifestyle. They believed in a vision that was bigger than their lifestyle. And they believed in a purpose that mattered more than their comforts. And they believed in a mission that was more important than their closeness to family and friends. And so they sacrificed to go where others did not want to go. So here is leadership principle number 9. Leaders will go where others won't to accomplish a vision. What vision are you seeking to accomplish right now? What purpose is there for what you're doing with your time and your resources and your life that is bigger than your comforts and your lifestyle? Remember the first 2 principles we talked about from the first 2 messages in this series. Leaders should allow themselves to be deeply moved by problems that affect other people. And leaders shouldn't just ask God to fix a problem. They should ask God to help them be part of the solution. So what burden has God put on your heart? And are you seeking to be a part of the solution to that? Asking God to help you be part of the solution to that? And are you willing to sacrifice, to go where others won't go, or to do what others won't do to accomplish that vision? What is it in your life that's a purpose that's bigger than you? We're all searching for purpose in life in one way or the other. There are a lot of ways that we could apply this right now. A lot of purposes that we could think of, visions that we could think of, and maybe some of those are popping into your head right now. Hopefully you're thinking of some of those. I just want to give you one example. One example of a purpose that is bigger than all of us, bigger than our comforts, bigger than our lifestyle, and something that we absolutely should be about as a church, as God's people, and that is this: bringing the good news about Jesus to the people all around us who do not know him. Now, we tend to call this outreach. Really, it should just be called being a follower of Jesus. After all, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. And then he commanded, go and make disciples and teach them to do everything I commanded you. It's what being a follower of Jesus is about. It's our mission. It's what we're supposed to be doing. I want to share with you some vision for how we as a church can be involved in doing this together. And this is something that I'm going to cover briefly, and we're going to unpack a little bit more in coming months. So I'm just planting seeds today for where I think we need to go as a church. Now, some of you might say, hold up, isn't the outreach area of this church under John Richardson? And isn't John currently on sabbatical? Yes, and yes. And so whatever I say, he'll just have to do when he gets back. So let's come up with all kinds of ideas. John and I have been talking about this for the last year and a half. We talked about it this week. We've been preparing for this. He's going to talk about this in a couple of months in our services here. But I just want to plant some seeds for where I think we need to go as a church. And hopefully this will help you to understand some of the things that you've seen over the last few months, and more importantly, the things that you'll see over the next few months. Let me just go through this quickly. We see four main aspects to our outreach vision here at the church. The first one is events. Events are like the wide part of a funnel. They have a big impact that doesn't go super deep, and that's okay. They allow people in our community to come into our doors who might never come in here for a service, but will come in here for a concert, or a comedian, or an Easter egg hunt, or a food truck Sunday, or a trunk or treat, or whatever it is. And so it's a way for us to connect with a whole lot of people that we may never get to connect with otherwise. We don't want it to end there, but it's a great starting point. Events can be a way for us to go out into the community as well and impact a lot of people that way and make great connections with them. So as you see us having events, there is a purpose behind these that is not just let's have a fun event. It's about let's connect with our community and let's have a relationship with them and invite them into our home. Then there are partners. Outreach partners are organizations that we might want to partner with. We have some now. We probably need to have more of them. Here's why. There are lots of types of outreach that we could and probably should get involved with in our community, the St. Louis area. Lots of things that we can do. However, that does not mean that it's wise for us to launch a new ministry for each one of those things when there's someone else out there already doing great work that we align with and we share our beliefs with. And so there are organizations that we need to evaluate and vet and partner with strategically so that we can get involved with them in tackling problems and reaching people in unique situations that maybe we shouldn't start something on our own. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel for everything we should be doing. There are great organizations that we can partner with that are doing good work in some of these things. Then there are teams. Outreach teams are something that we are launching here. Outreach teams are like an open approach to outreach. It's a platform, not a program. A lot of churches will identify an outreach program or 2 or 3 or 4, and they'll kind of decide this is our outreach program. This is what we're doing. We're going to do these things, and we'll be all about this as a church. And that's fine for some places, but I see a couple of problems with that. One problem is that there are always a lot of people in the church who say, that's great, but that's not how God has gifted me. Or that's not the passion that God has given me. I have a passion to do this over here. Can you help me with this? No, because that's not part of our program. And the other problem is that programs all have a life cycle. Methods change, cultures change, approaches need to change. The message does not change, but programs always have a life cycle. And so churches find that they put all their eggs into this program basket or these program baskets, and then in 10 years they find out that doesn't work the same way that it used to. And they find themselves just having to start over again and failing to find their purpose in all of that. And so our outreach team concept is more of a platform than a program. We want to provide training and guidelines and coaching and resources for people to dive into all sorts of different outreach things that we may never think of. There are some creative ideas in this room and some gifting in this room right here that I don't know about, but if we are willing to commit to equipping and empowering people to reach out into the community in any way possible, to let nothing stand in our way to reach people with the gospel of Jesus, there are some weird and wacky ideas that are going to help us do that. And I don't know what all of those are, but I believe that God is working in people's hearts, and we need, as a church, to be helping to support that. We want to build a platform for outreach, not just a few programs. And the last one is missional living. What is missional living? Well, basically, it is living every day of your life on mission for God. And a big part of that mission is to help other people to find him, to connect them with Jesus. This is where we want everyone to go. This is what we struggle and strive for. This is what I fail at too often. I know I need to do this, and yet it's hard because of the distractions of everything else that goes on around us. In fact, some of the times it's actually church stuff that can keep us from actually living this out, which is really unfortunate. But we want everyone in our church to be involved in living missionally. If you want to have some ideas on how to do that, go back and watch our series from last year called How to Neighbor, and it'll give you all kinds of ideas for how to live out missionally. Because the gospel was not supposed to end with you. The gospel came to you on its way to someone else. And that could be through an event, that could be through an outreach ministry, or that could be sitting in an airport waiting for your flight. That's living missionally. Let me try to tie all of this together here. There were people in Israel 2,500 years ago who sacrificed their home and their family ties and their friends and their support network and their jobs and their comforts to move into a city that they had never planned on moving into and rebuild and redeem that place for God. They did that because they believed in a vision that was bigger than their lifestyle. They did that because they had a purpose that mattered more than their comforts. They did that because they believed in a mission that mattered more than their closeness to even their friends and their family. Don't you and I have a better purpose than that? We have the purpose given to us by God to reach out to those around us, all around us, and share Jesus with them. And redeem that place for God, redeem that person for God, to connect with them, to connect them with Jesus. What are we going to sacrifice to do that? What are we going to be willing to give up to go reach those people and redeem those people for God? Perhaps for some of us, missional living is actually going to look like finding an area that has no gospel witness, could even be in the St. Louis area, and saying, we're going to move into that place to go reach those people for Jesus. Does that sound radical to you? Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take people who are willing to say, we're going to live with and be with and build these relationships to reach these people for Jesus. And we as a church need to rally around those people and support them and make sure that they don't get burned out, because it's so easy to do when you sacrifice so much to redeem a place for God. Would you pray with me? God, it is extremely convicting to think about what these people gave up to redeem Jerusalem for you. And yet we have been given this task. 2 Corinthians says that you have tasked us with being ministers of reconciliation, that we are supposed to go bring this message to others to reconcile them to you. And it's incredibly convicting to think about the fact that so often in my daily life, I choose to do the things that I want to do or that I enjoy instead of being more missional and reaching out to others. So God, over the next few months, as we focus in on this more as a church, as we bring more opportunities and ideas, and it doesn't even all have to come from us as a church, as we, just as a body of Christ, get more focused on sacrificing to reach more people for you. Lord, I pray that you would guide us, that you would give us creativity, that you would give us energy, that you would help us to have a renewed passion for reaching people that you care about, that so often we just walk on by. Help us to be willing to sacrifice, to redeem people and places for you. And in Jesus' name we pray, amen.